excited for y'all to be here. Like, this is a duo that we didn't know we needed, but we really do. Having this conversation with two of my favorite people, doing amazing things in our community, I think brings voice to an issue that's prevalent in our community. And so I asked you here to talk about those things because I know that they've had the topic you've had experience with intimately and personally. So I thank you, Mo, for coming here, and I thank you, Ocean, for being part of this important conversation. So I want to start off with introductions. I just gave them your name, but I want you to introduce yourself. Who are you, and why is this topic important to you?
Yeah, I'm Mo Hansen, and I am a 29-year-old Cancer, period. And I work currently in agriculture, so I do community agriculture education, and specifically for Black adults that have lacked a lot of access to space and knowledge on how to grow their own food, things like that. So I teach people about sustainable produce and medicine. And I also run a food shelf with this lovely person over here. And we run a farmer's market, and we do community everything. We are a Rolodex of information.
Why is this topic important to you?
This is important to me not only because I've personally experienced it, so it has had a lot of influence in my life and how I move, but also because almost every other femme-presenting Black person that I know has experienced it and has not always had the words, but I always do. And so I'm here to speak on it.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
yeah, I also get to work at this fabulous farmers market, and just in general, like, I'm Ocean, and I am just really excited to be in community in general. I feel like I just sort of hang out with my friends. That's kind of like my identity. But I do a lot of gardening, and specifically thinking about this topic, I feel like I've experienced most of my own violence in quiet, like when there are not other people I know around to witness it, and I've done a lot of the processing of it quietly as well. And then when I have spoken about it, like Mo has said, I've been really surprised to find out that like everybody I know can relate, and that often many of us walk through life holding experiences and wisdoms about what we've been through, and really we kind of do all of that by ourselves. It's like, I think it's really important that people sit down and talk about it more than we do, because it's really liberating to like release those things.
Right. So you talk about like silence and suffering and silence, right? And handling things by yourself. And so can you talk about, is that part of the equation when you hear that like domestic violence isn't as widely understood in the LGBTQIA community? Like, why isn't domestic violence understood in the same ways that it is in cisgender heterosexual relationships?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of like an easy starter reason, and then it kind of bleeds into the many different intersections and experiences people have. But I think it is because of the fact that legally, a lot of the ways that you can handle domestic violence are based upon a cishet relationship example. I think the law follows through with a lot of, and when I say cis, I mean cisgendered, and het means heterosexual, obviously, so putting them together just to shorten everything up. But I would say that because the law only really specifically covers so much, and because queer people have been looked at as like the fringe of society for so long instead of just your auntie, you know what I mean? Like it could be anybody. But because of the isolation of queerness in the general whole of society, it's looked at as something that is confusing to a lot of people. On where like we're blurring the lines. The lines have been blurred. The lines were never so crisp. You know what I mean? And these things have existed in queer relationships and amongst queer people, whether they're in queer relationships or not, or they identify that way or whatever. All of queer people have had the same amount of space and time to experience violence, right? So I think that that's kind of where the initial confusion starts on like, how do we pinpoint this?
Mm-hmm.
And there's no pinpointing this because it comes in so many forms.
Yeah.
There's not really an easy way.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I echo all of that. I feel like domestic violence as a it's been interesting to reflect on how hard it is for me to consider myself that specifically applies to me, because my understanding of domestic violence is still, as a 29-year-old person who thinks thoughtfully, supposedly about things, is like between two people who cohabit, you know, who like have this really recognizable relationship structure, and who hurt each other kind of in that like nuclear way that like monogamy and cis heterosexuality kind of like prescribe for relationships. And so then when I think about the many ways that I've related to people and how some of those have turned out really poorly and many have turned out beautifully, it's hard for me to like think about myself as somebody who's experienced that, or even people I know who've experienced that, because those kinds of relationships are already breaking down so much of what we've inherited about like how people relate to each other, that like conversations that other people are having feel like hard to access, you know? And so I can think about like times that I've talked to people about when you've been hurt, but I think that those words between queer people often become really individualized, and like it's like a one-on-one conversation where you're like, you were hurt by somebody in this way, okay, let's talk about that. But you don't necessarily have these big community-wide conversations or like tie yourself to this bigger narrative of like how people in general are hurt, because I think that it's so hard to like connect your story to these bigger stories.
Yeah. As queer people, we're like often left amongst ourselves to have these conversations. Just like you said, it's just very like individual. Like I am having this issue with you, and we are, I guess, left to deal with this ourselves, right? And sometimes when it goes past that, when it goes past being able to handle it amongst yourselves, is when you have to start thinking about all the things I was talking about the legal stuff. Once it gets really far past handling it like personally, that's when it starts to get really big and scary, right? And that's when people just don't do anything. And that's when you'll find people that have been together for what, like 20 years, that experience that on and off throughout the whole time, and because they might be queer, they never handled it.
Yeah.
Because no one was going to take them seriously. So they might as well be quiet.
So speaking of taking them seriously, so like, can you talk about the role of even like power dynamics in queer relationships, size, sex, class, gender, as it pertains to domestic violence?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would say that because of the alternatives to people's expression and existence and all that, things are just going to be different. You know, we have different terms that we use to identify ourselves and each other. Things like femme do not mean what a cishet person probably think it means. You know, I in many ways am a femme person, and in many ways I'm not. And I claim that whenever I feel like it, right? Because I have the freedom to do so.
Yeah.
But when you have a person of queer experience, and I use queer as an umbrella term, just, you know, we could be here all day.
Yeah.
But you already have experienced adversity in so many different facets of your life and the unsureness of yourself. So when you are experiencing that emotionally, and on top being a large femme person who is maybe more of like a quiet person by nature, you're going to be someone who might still be physically looked at as intimidating, but you would never. You would never. You might have given up violence completely, right? And that might not be something, but then the fact that you would never, another queer person doesn't care that you're a big femme. They just care that you would never, right? It becomes like the smaller aspects of the conversation, because then it kind of turns from the physical parts are not as important. When it comes down to the actual violence, the physical parts are obviously important, because if you're bigger than me and you're going to punch me in the face, then it's going to hurt more. But when it comes down to like the lead up to physical violence, whoever has power is oftentimes looked at as the more masculine person. Or vice versa, I guess I should say that backwards. The more masculine person is looked at as the person with more power. And that is where heteronormativity seeps into queer relationships and causes a lot of harm.
Yeah.
Because the point of us being queer is to not use heteronormativity as our baseline. Because it's not. You know what I mean? It's everyone else's baseline, and it can be or it doesn't have to be. Even if you're in a straight relationship, it doesn't have to be where you come from or where you lead to.
Yeah.
You don't have to be, I'm a masculine man and I am a feminine woman in any relationship. But if that's just who you are, that's fine. But in queer relationships, when you are blurring those lines, a lot of times it's just left up to what we naturally are conditioned to believe, which is masculine, strong, feminine, weak. And I personally experienced domestic violence under the guise of heteronormative, like toxic misogyny, right? Toxic masculinity. That's the thing, right? It's all of this, like studs. So I'm someone who only dates black people as a black person. Cultural things, it's just hard. But for a long time, I only dated studs, which are masculine black women that are gay. And I am a very strong person. I'm very strong-willed. But I still was somebody who ended up being abused physically, emotionally, verbally. And it was because I gave up my power to serve her as her femme queen. And she was very hard up on her, I'm a stud, I'm masculine, I'm hard, I run this, right? And I let her. And letting her take control early in the relationship is what let her believe that she could physically take control of me. And because I had already let her, she just continued. And it went up until the point where it was either I die or I just leave, right? I had no more control because the masculinity she learned and she was taught by the masculine people in her life, men or otherwise, that is what was ingrained in her in terms of romantic relationships, even with her family. The women in her family, she treated the same way. And that was the issue. She was way smaller than me. She's like 5 feet tall. I'm 5'7". You know what I mean? I'm like 300 pounds. She's like 150. It was very much, I was double her size, and she still had a leg up on me every single time because she was the one that truly believed she had the power. Because she was told that she did, because she was masculine. And we have to.
That's the nuance.
Yes.
That's why this series is called Nuance.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of people don't understand that, right? So can you talk about the nuance in power, class, size?
Yeah.
And how are the ways that it shows up differently for the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I think what Mo's saying is exactly what it is. I think at the end of the day, it's always really individual. And whether or not you follow along whatever kind of scripts you were given when you were born, our job is to figure out what our own story is. And then I think when you can't have something so simple, it becomes a lot more about okay, what are the ways in which you hold power and what are the ways in which I hold power when we inevitably hurt each other? Because I think that's another thing you learn early on in life as a queer person, is that even people who love you will hurt you. And even when you love someone, you will hurt them. People not understanding you, who are very close to you, family, friends, etc. And rejecting you for parts of you that you can't control, and realizing that parts of you that you can't control are hurting these people in ways that you didn't have, control over.
You learn to let people hurt you that you care about.
And that's
being
part
a
of
queer
life.
person. Yep.
Right? And that people are gonna hurt you and not even, and that's an inevitability. What matters is how do we take care of each other?
Yeah.
And how do we try to stop? How do we try to build peace with each other? And that's where those questions become, I think in some ways easier to deal with when you have been queer because you don't have those sort of like blanket ideas, so you have to suss it out. But also they're really hard. It's really hard to like realize, for example, that you have power over someone because you're twice their size. Queerness is so isolating. And when you're isolated, you do not have power, right? Like, even if you're the one hurting the other person, because I think also domestic violence too often becomes like the aggressor and the aggressed. But anytime that there's hurt happening, both people are being hurt. Like if you're hurting someone, you're also hurting yourself. That's a dehumanizing thing for both people involved, right? And when you're alone and you're not talking to people about the relationships that you're in, and you're not talking to people about the people that you love, beyond the simple, because queer people learn how to keep it simple. We say, it's going good.
Yeah.
People are like, how you doing? You're like, oh, I'm dating someone.
Yeah, you don't want to overcome. I do that all the time.
Here's their name. I can tell you their name, I can tell you their job, and I can tell you how many days a week they stay over, right? Like, I'm going to keep it really nice and simple because you're not going to understand, and you're going to react like, when people are just like, I could never, right? Or when people are like, oh, that's different. Like, when your first reaction is to just name the ways that I'm strange, I'm not going to tell you any more about the ways that I am, but they're not strange to me. That's how I am relating to this person in this deep way. So you learn not to share any of the details, and then how do you even navigate those many different power dynamics that maybe you each have, you know? Because you're not even talking to anyone about it. You're not in community to have those, like, because you have to check yourself, you have to be able to check the other person. There's so much that goes into that.
Absolutely.
Can we also really quick, because you brought up class, can we talk about how privilege is the hugest thing that looms over all of this? Is that, like, in the relationships I've been in, we both lacked similar privilege, and also in many ways as a light-skinned person, I had a lot of, like growing up, a lot of class privilege over the people that I had dated, and a lot of just general being in the world privilege by people looking at me differently because I'm light-skinned and they were not. And a lot of these things are the root of violence that you do to somebody else and violence that someone else does to you because of that power dynamic. Privilege is always going to be a part of this. If you are somebody that is a person of color dating a white person, and that person isn't physically being violent to you, but every single time you go somewhere, they got something to say about how you need to maybe pipe down, or don't talk like that, or people are gonna look at us weird, that's emotional abuse. And you know, those are things that a lot of people think are okay because it's just, you know, a little comment, right? But that little comment to you was intentional from them, and it's literally just someone using their power to control your actions, right? And that's something that I feel like kind of is a blanket on top of all of this.
So what do you think are like the root causes or the or like barriers for survivors getting help in your community? Like what are some of the barriers, if you could name them, wanted to?
I mean, I already mentioned the whole legal system not prioritizing the safety of queer people. That's just not it. Obviously, Black people, no, it's just not a thing. But also, just like, we are also still learning how our dynamics work and how to name them and how to express them in a way where, because in those scenarios when you need help, that person does need to know your dynamic with this other person. They need to understand how we've gotten here to a certain extent, and explaining that when you have a very niche relationship, or the way you explain that relationship is a very niche thing, they're gonna still be sitting there like, so you're both girls, I'm missing it.
Right.
And it's just like, she's not my homegirl, she's my partner. You know what I mean? This isn't my friend. This is someone that I am living my life with. The same as you would with somebody that you care deeply about, romantically, intimately. You know what I mean? Like, there's just an ignorance that comes along with just not knowing a lot of queer people, or not investing time in asking your queer friends and family about their lives, which is a simple way to start curving that into a more understanding space and conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the barriers?
I think it's connected to that too. I think we talked about isolation, but I think being able to talk about what's going on is the number one thing. Always. And so rarely do we have places where we can talk about what's going on.
Other than with each other.
Yeah.
And we don't always have the power to do something about it as queer people.
Yeah, because we don't always have resources. Like I think I've had friends who are like in shitty situations or.
It's okay.
Sorry, okay.
These are all your own.
We're going.
Okay. And it's been like, well, but you don't have a place to go, for example, or whatever. And then like, we're all just a bunch of pories sitting here being like, darn, wish we could help you. You could stay on my couch or whatever. But
That's so real.
yeah.
We laugh about it now because we've literally lived that many
Yeah.
times over, but it's just like, yeah, your friend could call you tomorrow at our big age and still be like, hey, I need somewhere to stay because my partner is tripping or they're going through something and they're taking it out on me, right? They're being abusive and all this stuff. And it's just like being poor and being queer is one of the biggest intersections of identity that I've ever seen in my entire life. Most of the poor people I have ever known in my life have been queer. Queer and black, but usually the intersection is poor and queer, right? And like those two things, when you're trying to be in any relationship, is kind of rough. Because you're just like, I'm different, and also I have no money. And if they have money, they're just different.
Yeah.
They have taken a load off on the having no money part.
So you talked about resources of being available, and I hear like money, right? Housing, right? What other resources are needed, and what other things should we be considering? Because there are going to be a lot of people that can relate to what you all have said today, and there will also be people in position to help that will be listening to this. And so, what resources are needed, and what other things should be people that are in a position to help be considering when solving this prominent issue within your community, within our community? This is, y'all are my people, you are a part of our community. And so, like, what can we do? It starts with the conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm super glad you're here.
Yeah. One thing that like comes to mind immediately that seems really big that I literally have never thought about before, but this seems like it would fix so much of what I experience and what my friends have, is having somebody that works in community that like does like, they could be an organizer, they could be anything, right? But someone who is dedicated to spending a lot of their time having these conversations and educating the public, like a public service, like, once a month, somebody has just a workshop where they open up a space where they educate queer people about violence in their relationships and what are their options, right? So that would mean, learning about legal options that are inclusive to queer and like trans people in particular. That is a legally complicated web once you start trying to call and say, I need help with this. But if there could be a person that could navigate that space and just at least have a resource list that could, like I said, once a month, show up, be there, give people the resources without them having to ask, because that's the biggest thing that stopped me from asking before it got way too late, is it's exhausting to have to ask when you're actively going through it. You're not going to want to. You're scared, or you feel like it's not worth it. You feel like if you get so deep down into it where you no longer feel like help is going to do anything for you, you need someone to tell you the help instead of you need to ask for it, right? So I think having some communities set up with even just like a resource list, you can stay to hear my spiel if you want to go, right? But I think something like that would be incredibly helpful. And there are resources.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just, those resources are often given specifically to caseworkers of queer and trans people that are going through something, and that's once you've already gotten legal involved. That's once you've already become a big part of the web that is the state, right? You have to already be disabled, or you have to already have gone through this before to have that access. And that's just not, it's too late at that point.
That's funny because my brain went to like kind of the other end of that same thing that you were talking about as I'm listening to him. Like we're saying the exact same thing this whole time, but I'm just like abolition. Like we need to have like violence violence comes from the world
Mhm.
and it enters into our personal lives.
Mhm.
Violence does not come from us.
Mhm.
I do not hold violence in me when I wake up in the morning.
You weren't born
If
that
I
way.
enact violence on someone, I want to be obviously very like held accountable for that. But I also want us to like look outwards and be like, okay, so like we're all hurting each other.
You know, as I think, and I think about like my positionality, the Y's positionality, like I think it makes you all make a stronger argument for one, community members stepping in, right, and doing something, acting on something, right? This is just a conversation. I like to start with conversation, but you all have given us so much to act on, right? And that's my hope from this conversation, is that people will take what you all have said and what others have said from this whole series and do something, right? Because you are part of us, you are part of our communities, and you deserve, right, that peace, you deserve that love. And we are in a unique position to help. And so I want to continue to call out those that are in position to help, that hear this and won't move, right? It's critical that we move like yesterday, like the 10 years ago. But now that we're here today, we can move forward and move this conversation forward. And so that's my hope. I know maybe you have different hopes for this conversation, but I have truly, really, you've helped me to understand, right, the nuance that exists. Sometimes when it's not our experience, we don't understand, and that's why it's so critical to have these conversations. But I want to thank you for sharing bits and pieces of who you are. I see it regularly. Y'all are amazing. Mo and Ocean. But I want to thank you again for sharing your time with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, yes,
You're a
yes.
doll.